I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Brown, who is going to speak on the heritage ecosystem, valuing the everyday, the everywhere and the everywhen. Steve is a Senior Research Fellow on the Australian Research Council funded Everyday Heritage Project with the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra. He's also a Special Advisor with GML Heritage and is a co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Cultural Landscape Practice. He's also a co-editor with Clamara Pocock and Robert Mason of the special issue of Historic Environment on Queer Heritage 2024. So we will have some time for questions using the Q&A portal after Steve's address, but please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Mandy, and thank you to Robin and Trice for that powerful welcome to country. I acknowledge that I'm on the unceded land, seas and skies of the Whadjuk. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to all Indigenous people here today. I thank the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, the Heritage Council and the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Committee for the invitation to speak today. Thank you to Hannah Bailey and Alethea de Boulay for your support and assistance. Do I wave to get the slide changed? Oh, there's something here. Thanks. I'm excited and feel a sense of trepidation at being here today. I am delighted for the opportunity to have my career circle back to Western Australia. I began my working career here in 1976 in the field of Indigenous archaeology. In 1984, I left WA to work over east, and over east is where I continue to live and work today. It's therefore a privilege to return as an ex-sandgroper and as an academic and practitioner engaged in the field of heritage studies. Please indulge me as I continue to say a little about myself, including my many positionalities and intersectionalities, by which I mean my identity is not just one thing, but rather many things at once that as a result cause me to have simultaneous allegiances to multiple and diverse communities. To start, I am one of the more than 30% of present-day Australians born overseas. I have British and Italian heritage and was born in the then British colony of Kenya. When I was 7 years old in 1963, the year Kenya achieved independence, my parents migrated to Australia for a better life. I attended schools in Bakers Hill, Condinnon and Northam before studying archaeology, anthropology and history at the University of Western Australia. After working for the WA Museum as an archaeological consultant, I left WA seeking opportunities to work in different parts of Australia and beyond. I have subsequently worked and lived in Tasmania, Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. In Queensland, I was a member of the physical theatre troupe Rock and Roll Circus, which was a high-flying career departure from the before and after. Given this past, and having lived for extended periods at more than 28 properties, it's fair to say that I have a history of transience. In the words of Jean-Sébastien Marcoux, a transient process of house moving requires things to be divested, relationships reshuffled, and memories refurbished. For most of this period, I viewed myself as placeless, and this didn't really change until I lived in Arncliffe in Sydney. In 2015, after completing my PhD on place attachment and domestic gardens, my husband Alan and I brought her and moved to a fantastic 56-hectare rural bush block located some 80 kilometres northeast of Canberra. We have named it Gozinta, which is the name my paternal grandfather Quinton gave to his coffee and dairy farm in the Trans Nzoia district of Western Kenya. For Quinton, the name encapsulated the experience of farming, All the money goes into the farm and none comes out. We manage our goes into, which is on the boundary of Ngunnawal and Gundungurra countries, for conservation and love. Having presented my majority statuses, old, white, male, and some minority statuses, gay, migrant, rural dweller, archaeologist, heritage scholar, practitioner, and environmental conservationist, plus I voted yes in the Voice referendum, I suggest that we might think of intersectionality as akin to the heritage ecosystem, in the sense that each organism is part of a complex and interrelated system of social, economic, political and environmental networks. In short, individual people's lives, like mine, are comparable to heritage places in that they have things in common with other people and places, but simultaneously each is different and distinctive. Each has its own qualities and characteristics that can persist, adapt, change and transform over time. Furthermore, individuals and places are never isolated. Everything relates to everything else. Hence the potential of the ecosystem metaphor. And that's my segue to the theme of this conference. Before exploring the concept of heritage ecosystem, I will use an example from an everyday heritage place and object from my own work to talk about interconnectedness. In 2010, as part of my doctoral research, and frankly because of my desperation to undertake archaeological excavations after a long period of not doing this much loved activity, I investigated the material heritage of my own property, a 347 square metre suburban block in the suburb of Arncliffe in Sydney. In addition to assembling objects unearthed while gardening and recovered during house renovations, I undertook 6 small test excavations. From these, I catalogued 3,600 things, ranging from discarded Aboriginal stone pieces, fragments of 19th and 20th century ceramics and glass, bits of bone and metal, as well as masses of plastic fragments indicative of post-World War II production, consumption and technological change. From amongst the considerable collection, which was exhibited at the Canberra Museum and Art Gallery in 2024, was a metal teaspoon. The biography or itinerary of this item illustrates connections across space and time and their links to local and global events, that is, the relationalities and ecosystems. On the 15th of November 2009, while digging at the side of the house, a bent metal teaspoon appeared. It was not until I washed the spoon that I noticed a stylised Union Jack flag and Air UK etched on the handle. Air UK was an airline that operated from 1980 until 1997, after which was acquired by Dutch flag carrier KLM. Air UK's flight network served the British Isles and continental Europe, but the carrier never flew to Australia. So how did an airline teaspoon, presumably taken by a light-fingered passenger or unruly flight attendant, end up bent and discarded at the side of a house in suburban Arncliffe? I don't expect to ever know the real circumstance or events that led to this situation. But the spoon illustrates the movement and dispersal of things around the globe and the ways in which local suburban places are materially connected into a globalised world or ecosystem. Also, the spoon is evidence of the late 20th century phenomenon of the experience of time as accelerating. Not only is the teaspoon associated with the speed of air travel, but it also evidences a bygone era in the sense that the airline no longer exists and that metal airline cutlery has become rarer since 9/11. The themes of global connectivity, accumulation and speed in the late modern period are evident in the life history of the Air UK teaspoon. These themes also emphasise notions of place as extended and nested, of things as hypermobile and active, and thus point to the dynamic, local, globally distributed and multi-scalar nature of objects and places. And why is the spoon bent in the way that it is? Alongside the teaspoon, I recovered a syringe or hypodermic needle. The association of a deliberately bent spoon and a syringe point to the injection of an illicit drug. I suspect someone had snuck into the Fairview Street property to take a hit. I now consider what is meant by heritage ecosystem. I begin with heritage. There are numerous publications, policy documents and university units that seek to address the question, what is heritage? To keep it simple, I will use heritage to mean the places, things and practices we want to keep, a meaning that draws on the 1974 Australian Government report of the Committee of Inquiry into the National Estate, or HOPE report, and the work of Australia ICOMOS. However, it is important to acknowledge that this meaning is complicated and problematised when we ask, who is we? Who decides what we want to keep? How long do we keep things? In keeping things, what degree of change is acceptable? These sorts of questions are central to the work of critical heritage studies, which is an interdisciplinary field of study seeking to explore power relations involved in the production and meaning of cultural heritage. Now to ecosystem. It is important to note that some researchers and practitioners prefer the word ecological, as in an ecological approach to heritage. For example, the 2024 edited volume shown in the slide. Ecology is a term first used in 1866 by the German zoologist and evolutionary biologist Ernst Haeckel. Ecology refers to biodiversity at genetic, species and ecosystem levels, to all the dynamic processes and features of geodiversity and to all their interactions, often described as the study of energy flows in a system. Like ecology, ecosystem was also a term originally used in biology to mean a community of organisms and their physical environment acting together. Environment refers to both living organisms, biodiversity, and the non-living physical conditions, for example, geodiversity, biosphere, and solar system. These spheres are interdependent, with the living and physical components linked together through complex interactions, energy flows, and from a human-centric perspective, cultural meaning. Over time, the term ecosystem, largely drawing on systems thinking, has come to be used to cover any complex and interrelated system. For example, John Schofield has written about urban landscapes, such as modern-day Berlin, as ecosystems. The concept can largely work as a metaphor for identifying, describing, studying and understanding heritage places and landscapes, themselves living entities because of human, animal and plant populations that inhabit them and the geology and climates enveloping them. Further, the heritage ecosystems of the present day have been shaped by past living and physical environment interactions, and these evolving linkages will continue to shape the future of each heritage place. It is also notable that using the term ecosystem in biological and nature conservation necessitates a concern with contemporary concepts of sustainability and resilience, important considerations in the field of heritage. So what is meant when heritage and ecosystem are coupled as heritage ecosystem? Fortunately, a recent description is available in the Gunma Declaration on the Heritage Ecosystem, a statement developed in the prefecture of Gunma, Japan, earlier this year as part of an event to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the inscription of the Tomioka silk mill and related sites on the UNESCO World Heritage List, as well as the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Nara document on authenticity. The Gunma Declaration stems from a concern that with the complex story of Japan's significant role in the global raw silk market in the early 20th century, a heritage that is evidenced at some 1,200 places associated with the early emergence and global dissemination of silk production techniques. Drawing on the text of the Gunma Declaration, the key aspects of the meaning of heritage ecosystem are: first, it is a holistic and inclusive concept concerned with the linkages, web of connections and interactions across heritage components, such as material and immaterial attributes, cultural and natural elements, human and non-human spheres, species, Indigenous and scientific knowledge systems, as well as wider spheres including broader social, environmental, economic and political contexts. Consequently, a heritage ecosystem concept requires the application of interdisciplinary approaches to identifying and managing heritage places, things and practices. These fields, as stated in the WA State Heritage Conference theme statement, include environmental sciences, economics, education and technology. Thirdly, the heritage ecosystem concept is a useful device for raising awareness of sustainability, resilience, social justice and climate change agendas. As an aside, much of my work over the last 15 years has concerned the better integration of natural and cultural heritage, especially in the fields of protected areas and World Heritage protection and management. This work has sought to reverse approaches in the 19th and 20th centuries that were characterised by a clear distinction between culture and nature, an approach I have found to be effective in resisting the culture-nature binary or separation in heritage theory and practice is the concept of cultural landscapes. The phrase cultural landscape was coined in 1925, 100 years ago, by geographer Carl Sawyer, even though the concept had been around in various forms before that. In 1992, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee adopted the term cultural landscape, thus bringing the phrase to global attention. The phrase has diverse meanings across disciplines, geographical regions and languages, and there is a vast literature on the subject. I argue that cultural landscapes can be considered to encompass three broad meanings: as place, as process, and as practice. Both the heritage ecosystem and cultural landscape concepts emphasise the connections and inseparability of natural and cultural systems. Both approaches recognise the interactions of history, cultural practices, and ecological systems of selected places that have the potential to be designated as heritage. Thus, heritage ecosystem, like cultural landscape, is a holistic and integrative framework approach that aims to encompass and support the relationships among a place's components, or to use World Heritage language, attributes. Attributes can comprise the material dimensions of heritage, including built structures, infrastructure and landscape modifications, and non-material aspects such as language, creative practices, cultural traditions, craft skills, as well as biodiversity, geodiversity and other planetary processes. Attributes are the things that we recognise as the components of a heritage place, while it is the interactions between them that manifest the heritage ecosystem. To illustrate this point, I draw on the World Heritage Leadership Program. Here is an imaginary region that comprises an ocean, mountains, agricultural fields, an industrial city, and various structures dotted across them. The region is underpinned by maritime and terrestrial systems, urban and rural systems, that is, socio-ecological systems. Imagine a part of this region is designated a heritage place, a volcano and associated religious structure, a pagoda. The place is heritage listed for being an outstanding and significant example of an earth process and its association with religious beliefs and practices of a local community. The key attributes are the volcano, the pagoda, and the faith-based community, their beliefs, practices, and festivals. In terms of heritage ecosystem thinking, the heritage place is not an isolated property with a fixed boundary. Rather, the place has connections and interacts with its surrounding and wider setting. This is true in a physical landscape sense. For example, the volcano is part of an extensive geological system, as well as the broader environmental, economic and social and political contexts, such as the faith community may not be confined to the local area. Managing the heritage place requires an awareness of these broader contexts and their capacities to impact on the attributes and values of the listed area. I now turn to the work of the advisory body to the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, on better integrating nature and culture in the recognition, valuing and caring for World Heritage listed properties. To my mind, a strength of the heritage ecosystem approach is its insistence on recognising that heritage is a dynamic, evolving system influenced by human and natural interactions. The UNESCO World Heritage Convention of 1972 is widely known for the way in which it simultaneously brings together cultural and natural heritage in the same doctrinal text, while at the same time treating them as separate realms or fields. This disconnect arose from the perpetuation of Western Enlightenment thinking that emphasised dualisms or opposites, such as nature and culture. Incidentally, we can also see this division in the Australian heritage systems, where there is separate legislation, guidance and practice for each of natural heritage, Indigenous heritage and settler colonial heritage. For example, Section 9A of the WA Heritage Act 2019 recognises the existence of some natural environments as separate from human history. Again, a heritage ecosystem approach calls for integration of all fields in developing a connected practice. The 2010s saw a flourishing of international projects that sought to better integrate natural and cultural heritage in conservation. I've had the privilege of being involved to varying degrees with these projects, which in different ways seek to address an issue central to cultural landscapes, nature culture's interconnectedness. For example, Connecting Practice 1 was undertaken in the period 2013 to 2015 and involved sending specialists in natural and cultural heritage to listed World Heritage properties to explore the different ways they viewed places and their values. I was involved in the visit to the World Heritage listed property petroglyphic complexes of the Mongolian Altai, inscribed in 2011 as a cultural site. The fieldwork was undertaken by 2 ICOMOS and 2 IUCN members to better understand the connections between the local pastoral herders, the ancient rock markings and the landscape biodiversity. An example of a feature with overlapping values was Shivat Kyrgyz Mountain, which is recognised as a sacred natural site in local shamanistic and Buddhist beliefs, and is also an important location for the conservation of biodiversity and especially ibex. In this example, cultural practices and nature conservation goals are mutually reinforcing. In 2021 to 2023, I was involved in an ICOMOS IUCN Connecting Practice Phase 4. The case study for this phase was the World Heritage listed site of Hanseatic town of Visby, a medieval walled town on the island of Gotland in Sweden. In essence, this project sought to apply a resilience thinking framework aimed at supporting long-term planning for Visby and more broadly for World Heritage properties and other heritage places. The process promoted discussion about what future is envisaged for a heritage place by expanding heritage management planning to include 20-year, 50-year and longer horizons. The framework we developed aimed to guide managers and heritage custodians through a participatory process of preparing a long-term strategy to influence desired change in a heritage place. The definition of resilience used for the purpose of what we termed Wayfinder heritage is based in the acknowledgement that ecosystems, landscapes and cities constitute complex systems. Such systems are made up of elements that interact with each other, which change and adapt as the context around them changes, and their boundaries are difficult to define since they interact with other systems at both higher and lower scales. These complex interactions often lead to emergent events or characteristics that could not be predicted based only on the individual system elements, which is why uncertainty and surprise are common features of complex systems. For such systems, identifying their individual elements is insufficient and inadequate to understanding the interconnections between them. I hope it is apparent that both the integrated social ecological systems perspective we applied in the case of Visby has strong overlaps with the heritage ecosystem approach, since both recognise that humans and nature are strongly interconnected and that their interconnectedness is complex. I want to turn now to a current focus of my work and practice, which is around the idea of everyday heritage. The Everyday Heritage Project, funded by the Australian Research Council Linkage Program and industry partner GML Heritage, involves researchers and practitioners across 5 universities in Australia, including UWA, and 3 universities in Europe. And I want to acknowledge in the audience 2 of our team, Professor Jane Lydon and almost Dr. Naomi Preston, and also some colleagues who've worked with us in Dr. Constant Wyndham, Flavia Kipperman, and Luke Donegan. So everyday heritage is a term typically applied to the mundane, quotidian and routine things and practices associated with everyday life and everyday lived experience. Studies such as a 2015 National Australia survey of different kinds and degrees of cultural participation have demonstrated that less than half of the Australian population actively participate in heritage, which for the study was described as people who visit designated places and museums, while more than half the population are engaged with heritage in everyday life, and in particular via family history and genealogy, as well as historical engagement with military history, which is described as people who visit military sites and memorials. Gardening and cuisine are further examples of practices of everyday engagement with heritage, typically designated as personal, individual, or familial, and therefore unofficial. In the Australian heritage system, everyday heritage as personal or familial is typically not recognised in authorised or official heritage, including heritage registers. That is, the thresholds for meeting heritage significance tend to apply to cultural groups and communities rather than individuals and families. This is evident, for example, in the application of the criterion for social value. In our work, we suggest that the concept of everyday heritage can be mobilised through diverse heritage practices to both counter and complement established regimes of heritage. Our work aims to show how this form of heritage can be utilised and mobilised by both mainstream and marginalised groups to create sensory and aesthetic engagements and social visibility, as well as economic and political recognition, and thus act as a form of counter-heritage. We argue that everyday heritage is a concept and practice that can be strategically deployed by individuals, groups, heritage professionals and academics to enrich heritage practices and engender benefits for culture, communities and civil society. For example, digital technologies and online heritage participation enable individuals and communities to engage with both official and personal or non-official forms of heritage. In her study of the Sydney Opera House, architect Christina Garduño-Freeman demonstrates some of the ways in which people relate to architecture via participation on social media, showing how engagement with digital media can democratise heritage. Digital media is part of the contemporary heritage ecosystem. I have titled this presentation, The Heritage Ecosystem, Valuing the Everyday, Everywhere and Everywhen. In it, I'm trying to capture the ideas that heritage incorporates the everyday as well as the best and most representative, that heritage is everywhere, and the use of everywhen to denote continuous existence rather than stasis. Thus, in some ways, the adoption of a heritage ecosystem approach as holistic and multidisciplinary creates somewhat of a quandary. That is, the concept can potentially challenge the ways we understand, create and practice heritage. I want to address this matter by touching on the field of Indigenous heritage in Australia, although my thoughts can also apply to other forms of heritage. If we accept the idea of the heritage ecosystem and want to apply it in our thinking and work, then it follows that we need to investigate and understand the ways in which all elements of a place, its cultural features, lands, waters and skies, are interconnected and interact. As I have suggested, heritage ecosystem is an idea that has equivalence with integrated social ecological systems, perspectives and cultural landscape approaches. The use of a cultural landscape framework has been important, for example, in the developing World Heritage nominations for Budjbim Cultural Landscape, listed in 2019, and for Murujuga Cultural Landscape, currently under consideration for World Heritage listing, and which we'll hear more about from Amy Stevens later. Heritage systems thinking and cultural landscapes would seem to have strong commonalities and alignments with the meanings of the Aboriginal English term country, that is, holistic and inclusive, and the concept of caring for country, which is a complex notion related to both personal and group belonging and to maintaining and looking after the ecological and spiritual well-being of the land and of oneself. It is a phrase encompassing all parts of the landscape, waterscape and skyscape, as well as people, non-human species, and more than human or supernatural beings, including creation ancestors. There are significant lessons for us all in this Indigenous way of thinking. First, all parts of the land, waters and skies have significance to their Indigenous custodians and beyond. In Borough Charter and WA Heritage Act terms, this significance primarily centres on social community values. That is, strong or special meaning for any group or community because of social, cultural or spiritual associations. Second, and consequent on this, why do we continue to frame heritage as a set of bounded places or sites? For example, Indigenous art sites, tool manufacturing sites, dreaming places, missions and fringe camps. The response probably lies in the heritage listing approach as a pragmatic tool for identifying, protecting and caring for the places, things and practices we want to keep. However, an all of country way of thinking has profound implications for the regulation of heritage. To accommodate a heritage ecosystem approach, the regulatory process for Indigenous heritage could be restructured by recognising that all of country is significant. Thus, any impact assessment would start from assuming significance rather than having to demonstrate it. In this reverse thinking approach, developers would not typically engage heritage consultant companies dominated by non-Indigenous employees, but rather that each Indigenous community whose country or community might be impacted by a development is directly engaged by the developer. In this approach, the EIS process would become a negotiation concerned with measuring the extent and degree of potential harm from a proposed development, and then either mitigating impacts and or agreeing on compensation for losses to present and to future generations. On that note, I will end this presentation. Thank you for your presentation, and I welcome comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Steve. Very thought-provoking. Lots for us to think about. Like I said earlier, we're taking questions using your QR code. I've got direct access to that here. But while everyone's getting used to that, we also have a roving mic. We do need to speak into the mic for our people online. So if we've got questions, we've got about 13 minutes and 56 seconds to be precise. We don't want you to be late for your morning tea, but we do have some time to take some questions. So if anyone has a question, we'll organise for a mic to come down to you. Yep, just one moment. Can we have the mic on, please? Yep.
Hi, Steve. Darren Foster, Chair of the Heritage Council. Look, really interesting presentation, and particularly last point about, how we kind of, segment and classify, and that's often driven by legislation. Do you think the advent of native title, which is a more holistic way of recognising connection to country in its entirety, offers a better way of, giving the traditional owners a box seat in those impact assessment negotiations?
Thanks. Is that working? Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. I think I'm non-Indigenous, so I must make that clear. But in my many discussions with Indigenous people, there are and I'm sure other people here will be aware of this, there are very mixed views about the benefits of native title. So I would tend to see that as, and I'm happy to be contradicted, as a slightly separate system to the general heritage system that we apply. And I think while the native title system does have a kind of holistic perspective, I really don't see why other parts of the heritage system, the legislation, the administration, the policies and practice, couldn't adopt the same thing. Now, I'm being a little bit idealistic. I don't think I'm being a lot idealistic, but I think it's quite possible to do that. But it really does take quite a strong mind frame and also reorganisation if Indigenous heritage, historic heritage and natural heritage are going to come together more, and there's a more holistic view that heritage is part of the whole landscape. Every individual in one way or another engages with heritage, and that we can value those ideas while at the same time there obviously has to be pragmatic ways in which a place like the Heritage Council or the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Committee manage that system. So I probably haven't answered your question directly, but interesting thought to make that connection. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Another question's come through. So can you explain how we apply the notion of everywhen to heritage? I think I asked the same question earlier. Yeah.
Thank you, that was very helpful that you did. Well, everywhen is used in different ways. In my reading, it's used quite widely, but it's particularly been applied by a number of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, around Indigenous heritage. And to my mind, what everywhen is trying to do is break down a sort of a complete dependence on time as linear. That to think of time as in different ways. It might be circular, or it might be past and present in the same moment. Past and future in the same moment of time. So again, in my discussions with a number of Indigenous people, the idea of deep time, that has taken hold as a kind of reality and political necessity, I would suggest. But in other ways, the idea that all of country is created by creation figures is both past, present and future. That it is simultaneously, and I think everywhen tries to captures that simultaneous kind of idea of time, rather than segmenting it like we do, like Western views of it as past, present and future.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question, just touching on your last point around, I think, particularly, assuming rather than demonstrating heritage value. So the question is, just touching on the last point, would you say that through the establishment of Aboriginal corporations in Noongar country, that reversed approach that you've spoken about is now getting sought out more? And what would you advise proponents and consultants to help them adjust to this new way of thinking? Big question.
Thank you for the question. Well, I would begin by saying I am not, having left Western Australia in 1984, when there was a very different system of the role of Indigenous people in the heritage system throughout Australia. I'm not familiar with the current situation about the politics and administrative arrangements for Noongar heritage in the Greater Perth area or the southwest of Western Australia. So I would have to sort of say more in general that well, I don't want to speak for Aboriginal corporations. They have their own views and perspectives, and they're quite diverse. But I do think the general idea that heritage is everywhere from an Indigenous heritage perspective is probably true to all those groups. I see some very damaging things happening, I suppose, in the system, and here I'll talk more from the New South Wales perspective, which I'm more familiar, where there has been now 15 years of trying to introduce separate Aboriginal heritage legislation which takes Aboriginal heritage out of the National Parks and Wildlife Act. It's been obviously hasn't worked. 15 years is a long time for something not to happen, and you can't imagine even thinking of going to consult anymore with Aboriginal people when that's the situation. And now I've derailed my train of thought. I was going to talk about one of the systems that's been advocated is cultural mapping. So empower Aboriginal groups, corporations to undertake cultural mapping of their country, and then rank, of all things, rank what is most important. And that typical question, are burials more important than artefact scatters, is just a naive question, and I would suggest an ignorant one, to have to rank country, which is why I don't think we should go down that line, but rather we should say, well, if everything's significant and it doesn't need to be demonstrated from an Aboriginal heritage perspective, then it immediately becomes a negotiation. And I've seen some very good examples of that kind of negotiation. I'd say one in my experience was quite a long time ago in the 90s, actually, in Victoria, where we'd done some work. There was an archaeological survey, an anthropological survey, and the traditional owners said to me, okay, off you go. And the negotiation then began about compensation, and what they wanted was scholarships for education, a whole lot of things that were compensation for the loss of this case in a significant midden. And I think that negotiation is really up to those groups to have that kind of discussion on how they want to proceed. So negotiation rather than creating a hierarchy of importance of sites in an Aboriginal heritage context.
Great, thanks. Just expanding, I think, on the same sort of line of thought and notion. Someone has asked if you could expand the knowledge of the rights-based approach when applied to the mining heritage sector or mining heritage in Australia. With mining heritage accepted as a global human heritage, it appears in WA that we're very much behind in managing this rights-based approach, and that is inclusive of records management. So just your reflections perhaps on that.
I think this audience is very fortunate to have a speaker coming up in the next session, Amy Stevens, who's going to talk around human rights. So I'm going to slightly evade that question by talking about my recent holiday in Sweden. And in that holiday, I had this fantastic opportunity to talk at quite length, including a number of days, with a number of the indigenous Sami people. And northern Sweden, above the Arctic Circle, is I would say, has similarities with the Pilbara. There is deep iron ore mining and for other minerals. There is enormous forestry operations, not so popular in the Pilbara, but in the southwest, I guess, and transport networks. So the Sami are based on the natural movement of reindeer herds to high and lowlands. And so when you have railways, roads, mines, forestry operations, which are clear felling, there's profound effects on their lifestyle. And it's very problematic, the arrangements and the support of human rights, I would suggest there. In fact, there's quite a good paper on this topic, which is on the idea of organised hypocrisy, which is about Sweden sort of being willing to sign international doctrinal texts, the UNDRIP Declaration, other human rights declarations, advocate for other Indigenous groups around the globe, but they themselves, while there is a Sami parliament in Sweden, Norway and Finland, who can make recommendations to the national parliaments have been very reluctant to act on those recommendations from the Sami parliament. So it's it's a very difficult situation. I appreciate there is a mining heritage, and in fact there's fantastic stories of mining heritage, but it is the contemporary issuing of permits to mine and the depth of the collaboration with traditional Aboriginal groups about how those will work. You can tell me, I can't say. I have worked in the Pilbara more about if it's working better now than it did and what it needs to do improve, if anything.
Great, thank you. It's not so far afield, actually, that example, because last week, Robin Smith-Wally and Jodie Nunn, who received a Churchill Fellowship, actually gave a presentation on truth-telling and learnings around truth-telling for Western Australia, and they actually visited the same people over there, so quite close to home at the moment also. Also have another question, if you could, or how could you see an ecological heritage approach better expressed in museum collections and displays?
I'm not a museum person. What will I say? I think there's some good examples already of the way in which cultural knowledge and cultural objects are talked about in relation to the natural environment, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous environment. So I think bringing those things together can be very well done in museums and probably across the galleries, libraries, archives and museum sectors. I don't work in that area, so I'm sure there's probably some room for more improvement, but that kind of integrated thinking, I have seen that quite a lot in different museums and exhibition spaces.
Great. Some of the best examples of that? Just put him on the spot entirely. Question without notice.
Well, I think in Western Australia, Balya Budup, is it? Bullabardup, my apologies, is I would say it has that kind of integrated approach. When you look at some of the objects on display, and here I'm thinking about a skin cloak made in Binjara, the story is about the kangaroo, the skin cloak, the practice of making the skin cloak, its context in a broader cultural practice. So I do think stories of objects like that really do have an ecological or ecosystem approach because that is integral to the story of presenting that piece. And I think the same can be done and has been done with non-Indigenous objects, which shows that I'm avoiding pointing to good examples.
That's a terrific example. I can see some WA Museum people here as well, so great example. We're almost at time. Just got a final question very quickly. How can you apply your cultural heritage approach in the wider context in view of expanding multiculturalism in Australian society today in general? So in WA, for example, we have suburbs where 44% of the population is born overseas. So how could you apply your cultural landscape model to such areas?
Let me think. I think that if we take the view that heritage is never static, it's always dynamic, I think we're always asking what other groups now have an interest in this heritage. If it was a piece of colonial heritage that was gazetted as state significant, what other groups now have an interest in that heritage, and how is that interest expressed, and how significant is it to them? And I will just point to a fantastic piece of work done by Emma Watson and Dennis Byrne from Western Sydney University, where they did oral histories with Chinese, Indian communities in Parramatta. And they asked them as new migrants or families that had been there for a number of generations, what did they think about the heritage of Parramatta? Could they relate to it? And I suppose it's kind of surprising that there was a lot of relationship to that heritage. For example, some of the speakers from the Indian subcontinent, interviewees from the Indian subcontinent said, well, it reminds me of wherever I lived in India because that was a colonial country and you see the same sort of buildings. So whether that makes you feel good, bad or indifferent, they felt there was a kind of visual connection from the source country to the present country. And I think those kind of studies of the changing meanings or the existing meanings are important for thinking about the ways in which different cultural groups relate to heritage already listed or recognised and heritage they might make, like having, for example, I'm thinking of some of the Lebanese communities in Sydney meeting with 80 or 90 people in national parks for huge picnics, and it becoming a tradition, and national parks having to come to grips with the idea of there's all these people kind of having a great time in the national park rather than necessarily looking at the plants and animals and appreciating the conservation works. Just kind of different ways of relating to landscape, place and self.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, Steve. And